The rib stitch is commonly found on the edge of garments like the body and sleeve hem or neck edge. It's great for these locations because it has a lot of horizontal stretch, which makes it comfortable and functional and somewhat resistant to stretching out. It keeps the edges of the garment in good shape and keeps its form well. The rib stitch is easy to identify by its vertical ridges, which are made up of alternating columns of knit and purl stitches. Rib is named by the quantity of knit and purl columns in one repeat. For example, one column of knit and one column of purl repeated in a pattern is called a 1x1 rib. When naming rib, always reference the front side of the fabric, which will be the outside of the garment. Rib is named by the number of knit stitches by the number of purl stitches in its repeat. For example, 3 columns of knit and 2 columns of purl is called a 3x2 rib. If I change my mind and want to use the other side of the rib for the outside of the garment, it would be called a 2x3 rib. Rib is also great as the main stitch of a garment, like for hats, scarves, leggings, undershirts, and sweaters. It's also great for any garment where you want horizontal stretch and some texture. Here's my characteristic assessment of the rib stitch. This is a quick stitch to knit once you have your knit and purl stitches on their designated needles. Most basic rib stitches have a preset program module that you can paste right into your program. Those would be quick. If you have a custom rib that has either no repeat or a very long repeat, that is something you would have to program semi-manually, and it would take a little bit more time, but ultimately it shouldn't take much time. Because knitting time and programming time are quick, price for the rib stitch tends to be low. Rib does have a tendency to contract on itself, which can make it more dense, but this doesn't usually affect price because when worn, it stretches back out and forms to the body. So off the body, a rib garment can just look kind of thinner or smaller when it's contracted, and then forms to the body when worn and it stretches back out. If you want a strong, stretchy structure, rib is great. This is why it's used on trims and edges so often, because it's durable, but also comfortable for locations like the wrists and neck. Drape isn't so good because this stitch is overtaken with stretch and texture, which gives it more structure. So if you need drape or movement, I would go with another stitch. This is a super comfy stitch, mostly because of the stretch. It's used quite often on garments that come in direct contact with the skin, like undershirts and underwear. It's also great for form-fitting garments. The rib structure tends to follow the shape of your body, kind of like shapewear or bandage dresses, but without the really restrictive discomfort that comes with those tighter garments. It has its prominent signature vertical ridges. Its distinct texture makes it easily identifiable. This is a really interesting stitch because the weight can really vary. Because it has so much horizontal stretch, it can easily contract and curl into itself, creating a dense stitch if you leave it in that form. But most rib garments are stretched back out when worn and form to the body. And this gets rid of the dense nature that it has when unworn. So if a garment is tight, it will stretch to form to the body and the rib will be lighter. If a garment is really loose, the rib might stay contracted, even on the body, leaving a denser fabric. Because the rib stitch uses both the front and the back bed of the knitting machine fairly evenly, especially in an even rib like 1x1 rib or 2x2 rib, torquing doesn't tend to be an issue with rib. I have seen it happen if a really high twist yarn or single ply yarn is used, but it's still a lot more rare to see than torquing in jersey, for example, which is very common. Balance is great on rib because it uses both the front and the back bed of the knitting machine. Balance tends to be really good. The top and bottom edges won't curl because there are alternating stitches, so you'll see some wave happening, but there won't be any curling because those alternating stitches help prevent that. The left and the right side edges of rib will have some curling because those edges don't have the alternating stitches to prevent it. Oftentimes though, on a finished garment, those edges will be linked to a finishing trim or linked to another piece of fabric, so the edge curling tends to kind of go away or not be visible. The vertical stretch is nothing special, but the horizontal stretch is where rib really shines. Generally, the narrower the rib columns, the more stretch will be retained. For example, a 1x1 rib stitch will tend to be stretchiest of all rib stitches. Any other combinations like 1x2 or 3x5 will be less stretchy. I highly recommend this stitch if you want a stretchy fabric without using an elastic or lycra yarn. Maybe you're trying to use all natural fibers like wool or cotton, but you still want a form-fitting feel. Go with rib. The stretch will come from the stitch instead of the yarn. Creative versatility. This stitch has some interesting contrasting characteristics that can be fun to explore. It's interesting that this stitch can be form-fitting because of its high horizontal stretch, but that it can also be dense when allowed to contract into itself, and sometimes even structural if knitted with a higher tension. So the creative versatility with this stitch comes from its different potential states, and mixing the stretch, density, and structure together can form really interesting dimensional pieces. Just making this video has inspired me to want to create a rib collection, and if I ever have time in my schedule, I would love to do that. Let me know below what you think of the rib stitch. What do you use the rib stitch for? Don't forget to subscribe and click the little bell icon to be notified when new videos are released.